So my name is Simon Scarpetta. I'm an evolutionary biologist and assistant professor at the University of San Francisco. And so I've been a lifelong herpetologist, which means I study reptiles and amphibians. And in particular, I love to study lizards like horned lizards and iguanas and things like that, and sometimes salamanders and other stuff too. And the kind of work that I do is trying to figure out how things are related to each other, either using DNA sequences or sometimes morphology, or sometimes fossils, and then also trying to figure out how long ago different groups evolved and how they got to where they currently live. And that's about sums up most of the kind of work that I like to do. So, the focal point of the research is like you said, this particular group of iguanas that live in the Fijian Islands and then also Tonga in the South Pacific. And so it's four living species and then at least a couple extinct species of sort of medium-bodied green iguana that love to live in trees. And so, that may sound like, okay, that sounds like a lot of iguanas that you've heard about before. But what makes this particular group extremely unique is that they're found 5,000 plus miles and 8,000 plus kilometers from all of their closest relatives in the Americas. So all the other iguanas live in North America. We have a couple of species in the American Southwest, which we'll probably get back to. And then there's a number of species in Central America, the Caribbean, and then one that gets into South America. And so really it's a group that just just lives in the Western Hemisphere besides these four living species that currently live in Fiji and Tonga. And so, it's been kind of this enigma for biologists for a really long time. One, I mean, most importantly, how did they get there? They also do look a little bit distinct, fairly distinct from the other living species, although there's some similarities to one particular group, which ends up being their closest relative. But yeah, the range, the fact that they're so far out there, all alone in the middle of the Pacific, is what really makes them pop. When a large weather event happens, like some kind of big storm or hurricane, rainstorm, could even be something like a large wave from a tsunami. Really, any sort of thing that has a lot of wind or water and that could knock over a bunch of vegetation. That vegetation that was once growing on land can end up in the waterway, whether it's a river or the ocean, and then get moved through currents from one place where it started to some place where it eventually ends up. And so, this is something that we probably are familiar with whenever we look at the news and, see the results of a flood, moving around logs or moving around whatever. But, it's also something that moves around life as well. And so one, really famous example of this is that in the mid 1990s, some scientists saw a big mat of downed trees, basically, and sort of other tangled vegetation, moving from one island in the Caribbean to another after all of that vegetation had gotten displaced by a couple of hurricanes. And so what those scientists saw on that big mat of floating trees was a bunch of iguanas that were just doing their thing, living, being completely fine. And they ended up moving from one island to the other, about 200 miles away. And so people got to see this in real time, which is just incredible. Um, and so that basic idea of vegetation being knocked over and animals either being in it already or clinging to it and then getting moved from one place to the other via current, that's the basic mechanism for how this would have happened. Um, and for the iguanas, they're just so cool. They're a group that I would say is very predisposed to being a successful overwater disperser and to successful at moving from one place to the other across an ocean. They're pretty large, so they got some sort of mass to work with. They eat plants primarily, though not exclusively. So, if they're on a raft for an extended period of time, they might even have something to eat on the raft, which is what we call these sort of down bodies of vegetation. A lot of the living species are pretty resistant to heat or pretty resistant to dehydration and even starvation too. And so really they're pretty hardy animals. So, one, you have to be lucky enough to even end up on a raft in the first place. And then you have to be able to survive the raft. And so if there was to be really any group of lizards, much less any other vertebrate that could do something like this, it would be an iguana because they're so hardy, they're so good at dealing with really extreme circumstances. And so with respect to the evidence for how we know this, it came out of primarily what we call a phylogenetic analysis. So using some information, oftentimes from a genome, sometimes from the phenotype of an animal, to try and figure out how it's related to other things. And so basically, I did a series of analyses using very large genetic data sets and found out that the Fijian iguanas are most closely related, pretty unambiguously, to a group of iguanas that lives in the American Southwest, which is called a desert iguana. And so then through a series of further models after those initial genetic analyses, I basically determined that the radiation of iguanas that includes the ones on Fiji and the ones that live in North America is relatively recent. And then that the most likely mechanism by which iguanas would have gotten from North America to Fiji would have been a direct dispersal event and across the ocean rather than moving some other direction, whether it be across land through the southern hemisphere or across land through the northern hemisphere, some other way. I think not unlike many biologists, I was one of those kids who from age 2 started picking up frogs and picking up snakes and then never really stopped doing so. So yeah, the love for reptiles and amphibians has been a lifelong thing, and I was definitely fortunate to have family that were very encouraging of that, and teachers as well. So yeah, I was actually just talking to my 7th grade biology teacher and reminiscing about how awesome his class was. So it was one of those things that I just started doing when I was very young, and then just continued to really, really love it. And then certainly had a lot of support along the way, which was awesome. I guess what got me into evolutionary biology specifically is that during my senior year of high school, my high school had this program where you could kind of do a little project at the end of your senior year, separate from the rest of your coursework and kind of whatever it was you wanted to do. And so I went and volunteered and did some kind of research at the local university, University of New Mexico, and that really kind of caught my attention or caught my passion for studying evolution specifically. So reptiles and amphibians, I've been on them since day one. But I think having supportive people around you, no doubt that helps. And then also, when you have an opportunity to try something new, even if you haven't done it before, just seizing it and then seeing whether you like it or not. And then if you do, keep pursuing.